The Cincinnati Bengals have some cap space left, but is anything left for them to do in free agency? Let's break it down.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien. We're the Locked On Bengals podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. We're on YouTube. We're everywhere you get your podcasts. If you're new, join the 20,000 plus subscribers on YouTube that I keep shouting out this week because this is the week we went over 20,000. And we really appreciate all of you who helped us get there, and all the everydayers out there, all the you that make us your first listen. Appreciate all of you so much. And today we're going to do a mailbag for the first time in a while, James, and some clusters of themes and questions that we've been asked this week. And it starts with essentially what's left for the Cincinnati Bengals to do in free agency. The first question comes from Who Day with a lot of ice. One. And the question is, what do you think their plans are for all the cap space they have left? Are they looking for some good and serviceable players to get cut after the draft? They have a ton of space just sitting around.
Well, I think they could sign a cornerback any day now. I certainly think they're in the cornerback market, the veteran market. We saw some late signings last year before the draft to kind of shore things up. I remember asking Zach Taylor about the Irv Smith Jr. edition and how that kind of solidified the tight end room to where they didn't feel like they needed to force it. People are going to laugh at that now, but at the time, that's how we felt because they had brought back Drew Sample and they had done enough to get some bodies back in that room. And so cornerback is an area where I would expect them to address it. Sidney Jones was the guy that they added last year to solidify the cornerback room. They brought in Terrell Basham as well at defensive end to give them a little more depth there. And that was before the Myles Murphy pick. It didn't impact the draft. So would not shock me at all if they add a veteran corner. I expect them to add a veteran corner, but it would surprise me if it is Stephon Gilmore or if it's one of the, and he's probably the biggest name available. I think it will be someone that compares to the Terrell Bashams, the Sidney Joneses, a veteran that they like as a depth piece, but doesn't really impact the draft at all. So it might be a little bit of a better player. We know they were in on Christian Fulton, and so maybe it is someone like that. Fulton is now a Charger. He signed a one-year deal with them. So we'll see, but I would expect cornerback. And then the other element to this, Jake, and we talked about it on yesterday's show, is Ja'Marr Chase's extension. They are planning to try to extend Ja'Marr Chase. Whether or not that happens is a different story. But last year, I know that they set aside some cap room just in case they did get an extension done with T. Higgins. And I'm sure they're going to do the exact same with Ja'Marr Chase. So that part of that is certainly in consideration. Evan McPherson as well. And then to your point, and you could break this down, it's not like they're really sitting on $20+ million in cap space. Like some of these sites say, it is less than that. And I know you're keeping track of that to give our listeners and viewers a better idea of where they're at cap-wise.
Yeah, I think Over the Cap is fully up to date now with all the contracts and all the players under contract. And that's 61 players currently under contract for the Cincinnati Bengals and $23.5 million or so in cap space. And the problem with that number is just that, and this is true for every team, it doesn't reflect the rookie pool. And so the Bengals have 10 draft picks? And those guys all will have an impact on the salary cap. They also have to sign up to 16 practice squad players, and they've always carried eventually 16 practice squad players. And when you account for both of those things, like every NFL team has to do in some way, shape, or form, the Bengals actually have about $15 million of cap space left to spend, which is still enough to do something, by all means.
For sure.
I'm not saying they can't do anything. That's enough money to sign, because of the way the cap works, roughly infinity veteran minimum guys. Roughly. They actually can only sign about 20 more players, because once you add the rookies into the mix, they will be at 90 players or at 61 plus rookies, and then you only have room for about 20 more guys. So they could sign a bunch of guys for veteran minimum, and they'll have undrafted free agents as well, right? So maybe 10 more guys because they haven't had huge undrafted free agent classes lately. And you could see something like that for guys that are in that category that you talked about, James, the Sidney Jones, the the return of Mitchell Wilcox, which happened in July last year, and then he immediately went on to the physically unable to perform list. So they have space to do a little bit more, but it's not quite as much space as it looks like. But they could go sign somebody to a $6 million deal if there's a guy out there that they wanted to sign to a $6 million deal, especially if they did a multi-year deal, because a multi-year deal allows you to spread that out a little bit, and they haven't done a lot of spreading money out. Campbell,
Calais.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. They haven't done a lot of spreading money out this year, which is why they're maybe a little bit tighter to the cap than they have to be. But that was their approach to free agency. And this really ties into another question. People keep calling for another defensive tackle or cornerback or offensive line bet before the draft. Or are we at the point where they let the draft play out and they fill as necessary afterward? That question came from Hude Distad, and you kind of answered it. Last year, on March 30th, they signed Irv Smith. On April 5th, they signed Basham. And it wasn't until April 14th, actually, that they re-signed Drew Sample, according to the team's official transaction list. And then that was it until after the draft. And after the draft, it was Trevor Siemian and it was Mitchell Wilcox and Reed Sinnett eventually when they needed an extra quarterback. But there weren't actually a ton of moves after the draft for external guys.
No, and that's why I think that they're still hunting right now. And shoring up those areas can free up the draft a bit. I think corner would be their top priority. Obviously, defensive tackle. I think those are the two that I could certainly see. But it wouldn't shock me if they went any different. When you're talking about this level of free agency now, this wave, I would be surprised if they went and got another tight end. I don't think they're in that market compared to last year. But it was kind of weird last year how they missed out on all the guys and looked up and they prioritized tight end much more this offseason, just getting it done sooner, even though it was bringing back two familiar faces and adding Mike Gesicki to a similar deal that Irv Smith Jr. had. But no, I do think more moves are coming. I'm not saying we should be sitting on pins and needles waiting because who knows when, but I do think between now and the draft, they'll add, I'll say, I would put the over under at, if it's at 1.5, I would take the over because I think it's two veterans. And if
I think it's 2.5.
But then I take the under because I still think it's probably two veterans.
I think it's still 2.5 because last year it was 3. Between now and the draft, between March 28th, as we're recording this on March 28th.
Because all they did was re-sign Sample doesn't count.
I would count that. That's a transaction. He wasn't on the roster, and then he was on the roster.
No, you're just keeping. I'm talking about external guys. They've added 6.
External guys.
Yeah.
1.5. I think then 1.5. Yeah.
Okay.
If you're counting just any player acquisitions, because there's also a question here from Andrew Boss. Are there Bengals that could still come back to the team? Tyler Boyd, obviously the most prominent, and I don't think either of us are expecting that even now, even though he's still out there. But Josh Tupou, Max Sharping, Joe Bacci, Mitch Wilcox, Marcus Bailey, I could see any of those guys returning.
No doubt. And so, yeah, if you want to include, I could see multiple of those guys returning. Yeah. Like if you're Joe Bacci, why would you not want to play a little bocce ball in Cincinnati? Marcus Bailey, who sounded off on the hip drop rule, why would you not want to come back to Cincinnati? It's not like the market's been booming for you and you know how you fit in this offense or in this defense. And that's probably it, is he wants to see if he can get more reps on defense elsewhere, but doesn't feel like that's going to be the case. Tyler Boyd is unlikely, like you said, but some of those other guys I certainly think could happen. And one thing that did help Tyler Boyd, did you see that deal for that Denver made for the what receiver was that they signed?
I did not, but I am looking at overthecap.com right now. So if it is up there, I can find it.
Broncos signed receiver Josh Reynolds. They signed Josh Reynolds to a 2-year, $14 million deal.
There it is.
$14 million. That helps Tyler Boyd a bit at this stage of free agency. So we'll see. But I think that the reports are that the Steelers want him, and it's just a matter of money, and they're probably hoping that his price drops. And so we'll see if Boyd lands somewhere. I don't think it will be in Cincinnati, though.
I agree with you there. Let's pivot. Let's talk a little bit about the draft. Are the Bengals looking for an instant impact player in this year's draft. We'll discuss some draft questions here coming up next.
Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. And it isn't just the tournament. No. As we record this, we're just a few hours from opening day in Cincinnati Reds baseball. And you can wager on baseball. The NBA playoffs are just around the corner. And whether it's the NBA, whether it's the tournament, whether it's MLB, maybe NFL futures, FanDuel has got you covered. And right now, maybe you want to wager on a big upset or a number one seed. You're going to get $200 in bonus bets if you're a new customer, if your first $5 bet wins. So throw $5 on your favorite team or the team that you think is going to win. And when they do, you get $200 in bonus bets. Boom. Just like that. It's free money. And you can take advantage of it right now at FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Place $5. And when that $5 bet wins, you get $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all in the tournament. Again, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets.
Got a question from our Locked On Bengals Insider text group, James.
Ooh.
Besides Brock Bowers, are there realistic draft targets at 18 who would be a day one starter on this roster? The Bengals like to redshirt their draft picks, roughly. They've been doing this a lot lately. But who would be an immediate impact to make the team better? And shout out Governor Chief on Twitter, in addition to Noah, who is the Locked On Bengals Insiders question submitter. Both of them have very similar questions, and we're gonna talk about that now.
Yeah, let's start with positions, because to me, if you draft a Quinyon Mitchell and he somehow fell, and it's probably about as likely as Brock Bowers falling. If he fell to 18, I think he's a day one starter. I think Terrion Arnold out of Alabama is a day one starter. So there's two. I certainly think if you did draft an interior lineman, and it's probably just Jackson Powers Johnson, Grant Barton, we can throw in there as well since he made our bracket. Those two guys would push for starting jobs right away. I also think that Felice Fuaga, I think JC Latham, even Amarius Mims, those guys will push. They will get a chance. I don't think it'll be, all right, Trent Brown, here's the keys to everything. He's set to make $4.7 million max out there. So that contract doesn't say, hey, you have to play him. He can be a swing tackle. And so even offensive tackle, I think, can come in and make a push. Now, will Johnny Newton start? Will Byron Murphy start if you take a defensive tackle? No. But that doesn't mean they won't play. You rotate defensive tackles plenty. And so I would expect both of those guys to get their fair share of playing time. The same thing goes for corner. There's a chance DJ Turner is just awesome, like he was in training camp last year, takes a step forward, and then whoever you draft at corner is your third outside corner. That player still plays a lot, even if they wouldn't be labeled as a starter. So I'm not sure if I've covered every single position, but I've covered most of them. Wide receiver, that would be the other one, where they were at Brian Thomas's pro day. If they took a receiver, it would be a surprise. I'd say at this stage in round one, that guy wouldn't start a ton. I don't think, unless you put him, especially if it's Brian, you put him on the outside with Chase in the slot to start games. But that doesn't mean he wouldn't play a lot because they use receivers a ton. Mm-hmm. So most scenarios in my head, Jake, with what they do at 18, result in a guy who's making more of an impact than we've seen from Myles Murphy, than we've seen from Dax Hill during their rookie seasons.
And you should expect that when you're picking 18th instead of 30th.
Sure.
You should expect to see a guy that is ready to come in and play more right away.
More obvious needs now too, I would say.
There's more obvious strengths in this draft class too. You know they're not drafting a linebacker in the first round. You know they're not drafting a safety in the first round. The one position you didn't mention is an edge player, which I wouldn't rule out, but it's harder to see the path to the field for that position. That's where you would say it's not really a red shirt, because if they were to draft like Jared Verse, I think he's active on game day. It's just a matter of how much does he play and how do they get him on the field. But I think if you take one of those edge guys at 18, they're getting on the field right away. Any of the three edge guys I think they would consider, which I think realistically is probably two, which is Latu and Verse if Verse falls. And if Latu falls because of medical reasons, like those guys are good enough that they're going to be probably one of your two best edge rushers immediately. And do the Bengals see it that way from a playing time perspective? Probably not. But those are guys that would force their way onto the field. But if you had to like rank it in order, say by snap percentage or something like that, because that's the closest thing I can think of to an impact level, I would think that if there were an interior lineman, or say like Fatanu or Fuaga, if those guys start at guard, or those guys are JPJ,
Mm.
and they beat out Cordell Volson or whatever it is to win a starting job on the interior, like those guys would play 100% of the snaps as long as they were healthy if they won the job. And then Bowers would probably play like 70-80%. The tight ends are not 100% players for this team, but it's a huge impact, obviously. I think a defensive tackle will be around 50%, roughly. I think they would be heavily rotating, and if they were good, they would win a job by the end of the year, and that would be Murphy or Newton. A wide receiver, that one's hard. Like, assuming no injuries, the guys that they would pick in the first round are not guys that probably have slot versatility. And so how much are they comfortable moving Chase or Higgins into the slot or taking those guys out the field? Probably not very much. A wide receiver, hard to imagine them making a huge impact if T. Higgins and Jamar Chase are your starting outside guys and they stay healthy. Not to say that they wouldn't make any impact, but in terms of percentage of snaps, I think it would be lower for that spot than some others we've talked about.
Sure, just forecast wise, but both guys have missed time too.
Oh, of course.
And obviously we know Higgins is on the franchise tag, all of those things. So I wouldn't knock them necessarily, even though I don't see that. And the reason why I struggle with receiver, and I'm Mr. Receiver, but receiver at 18, is because of what you just mentioned, the versatility element. I think they want someone that is not a T clone. I think if they're going to move on from T, the long-term view is finding someone that's more versatile than T, that you can move into the slot and then move outside, and that can stretch the field and doesn't need to be like 6'4", 220, and can be a different shape, a different mold. Not that they would be against finding the next T. Obviously, I'm talking about Brian Thomas mostly here, but I think that they wouldn't mind finding or adding more versatility to that room. I would say cornerback would play a ton.
Yeah, that's the one I forgot. They would probably win a job. Terry and Arnold or Mitchell would probably win a job and play all the snaps.
Woo. He's nasty. I still can't believe people just don't know. People just don't know. They'll know if he falls. He won't fall, but they'll know if he falls.
It would be surprising if he fell. Yeah.
Oh,
I think it's an interesting question, though, because I do think that this year they go, and whoever they drafted 18 is a guy that I think should make a pretty significant impact on the team this year.
They should be able to find a lot of impact on the first 2 days of the draft. They have 4 picks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could realistically add a starter, 2 offensive starters, long-term insignificant contributors right away, skill player wise, and then 2 trench players that are instant impact guys. That's probably because it's like running back and tight end, one of those at least, one of the a wide receiver, and then trench players. Like I could easily see that. And then maybe it's corner skill, defensive skill player versus receiver, whatever. But I think that those first 4 picks, you're getting pretty high level of impact if they get it right, which is obviously always the case.
Yeah, that's another question we'll talk about at some point is what do we think the most likely positions are for those first 4 picks? And we don't have to order them, but that's a question that we'll talk about another time, and we'll figure out and break down. The next questions for today that we'll talk about here coming up next are about that interior offensive line. We have a couple of questions both about the draft and the current options on the team, and then punter. Can't get through a mailbag without punter questions, James. We'll go there to finish the show coming up next.
All right, Jake, let's keep rolling here. And yeah, I see the punter question. Eric, we see you. We're going to get to you. All right. So the next one would be Bengals _Zach. Is Jackson Powers Johnson in serious consideration at pick 18, or do you think the Bengals are in a we're set on the interior mindset. Also, Bengalorian says, what's the answer at guard? So multiple questions about the interior of the Bengals offensive line. I think you and I both agree that they'll address the interior of the offensive line. They should address the interior of the offensive line, even if they do bring back a Max Sharping or someone of that ilk.
Do you think Jackson Powers Johnson is in serious consideration at 18? Because I don't. I think that there's no forecastable, and I could, if they draft Jackson Powers Johnson at 18, we'll come back to this moment and we'll clip it and we'll roast me for it. But there's no really forecastable way that the first 17 picks could go that would result in my opinion, in the Bengals picking Jackson Powers Johnson at 18. In all the scenarios that I've done and all of the attempts that I've had, and even manually picking the first 17 in the draft, there's always something I think the Bengals would value more than Jackson Powers Johnson at 18. Now, if they trade back, that's where you could see them potentially pick Jackson Powers Johnson in the first round.
Mm-hmm.
But in my opinion, even if we think he's a really, really good prospect on the interior offensive line, because of the more valuable positions where they will have one of a interior defensive lineman, offensive tackle, cornerback, or wide receiver, or tight end available to them, I could see all of those being ahead of Jackson Powers Johnson in the pecking order.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Jackson Powers Johnson, and we'll see. Things can change. I think he could test, hasn't tested yet, could test, so could change things. But I think Brian Thomas Jr. is Brian Thomas Johnson. Look at me combining the two. If you could get both at 18, I would do that all day long. Now that'll work for me. But Brian Thomas Jr. I think would be ahead of Jackson Powers Johnson as of today. And maybe not. I think that there's a decent amount of interior depth, though. I think they'll look at it and say, all right, rounds 2 through 5, we can address the interior. We can add our future center / guard combo. And hopefully they do, because they need some younger depth there, some quality depth that could eventually start down the line. Jackson Powers Johnson, to me, could be in their top 30 on their board, but I think he's closer to 25 to 30, like you think, like you have a hunch about, versus 15th. And whoever they pick at 18, I would be shocked. In fact, it won't be. It won't be the 18th player on their board, because they're not going to have quarterbacks on their board. So they're going to get a player that's probably 12th, 10th, 8th on their board at 18. And it's not, I'd be shocked if it was Jackson Powers Johnson today. Could that change? I guess so. And for those thinking, you only think about skill positions and stuff, I'll just throw a disclaimer out there. I was all in on Tyler Linderbaum a few years ago. We talked about him probably every show for a month, Jake. So this is not an anti-interior offensive line discussion. I just don't think that he will be in serious consideration at 18 on draft night.
Well, and if they're picking at 30, we're talking a lot more about Jackson Powers Johnson this year, because the world of players is entirely different. And you don't have all these guys that I think are going to be positions of Bengals value more highly that are likely to be available to you. The other thing is, I'm not even sure if Jackson Powers Johnson is unanimously going to be interior offensive lineman 1 for NFL teams. I doubt that will be the case. I think Graham Barton is a guy that has a ton of hype around him. I don't know if hype is the right word, but could be IOL 1 for a lot of teams, especially with his 5 position versatility. And there's a little bit of projection there, but probably seen that way. I think Zach Frazier from West Virginia is another interior offensive line prospect that some teams might love. But by our board, Jackson Powers Johnson likely to come out number 1 when the board that, Joe Goodberry and Sands and draft guy Jared and I work on, and Neil work on every year. When we finish that up, it looks like JPJ is going to be IOL number 1, but I don't think that's going to be true for every NFL team. Now, what's the plan for guard? Do they challenge Cordell Volson this year? Are they happy enough with the way Cordell Volson finished the year last year to say it's your job to lose and we're not going to aggressively attack it? I could see an interior offensive line pick in that top 100, but I'm not sure it's something that I would consider the favorite necessarily, compared to some of the other positions we think they'll target? Do you think that they're aggressively thinking about IOL as a priority on day 1 or day 2? Probably day 2, realistically, on day 2.
Day 2, early day 3, sure. I think if the right guy is there, and it's because it's pretty simple. Ted Karras is in the final year of his deal. Alex Kappa, 2 years left. Okay, but what's the depth behind those guys? And then Cordell Volson. It's nice when you have a Cordell Volson who's startable and cheap.
Mm-hmm.
They need more startable and cheap in that offensive line room. And so I do think they'll consider it. Now, I don't think they'll force it. And they are clearly comfortable waiting on offensive line and finding the right guy with the right intangibles and all of those things. But I don't think they'll hesitate if the right guy is there in rounds 2 through 4 and obviously rounds 5 and beyond. So we'll see. Would not shock me at all if they address. They have 10 picks. Yeah. And so I expect them to take 2 offensive linemen minimum, probably 2 defensive linemen minimum. I would not be shocked at all if they take 3, if you count tight end skill players. It's 1 wide receiver, 1 running back, 1 tight end. I think that's pretty realistic. And it could be a double down at any of those spots. Probably not running back, but never say never. You don't know on day 3 when you have all those picks. So
I think a linebacker gets into the mix too at some point.
Linebacker for sure. And that's another one, like we said earlier, I wouldn't be shocked if they added one of their former linebackers to a low end deal and then double down and take one in the draft. Speaking of draft, is this the year that they draft another punter? Eric Willis says or asks, what do the Bengals do at punter? Felt like a lot of games last year were impacted by that position's poor performance. And obviously they drafted Brad Robbins in the 6th round last year. Will they double down? Will they draft another punter, Jake?
Are there draftable punters this year? I don't even know the answer to that question.
I'll tell you right now.
I pay attention to specialists in the draft, but I think that you can't rule it out. The Bengals have a history, see Jake Elliott, Evan McPherson, of drafting specialists in close proximity to one another and trying to get it right if they don't think they have it right. We know they will have competition for Brad Robbins. That competition has not yet emerged as of the time of recording this episode. They did not swing for one of the higher priced punting free agents. So
Torrey Taylor out of Iowa is the consensus number 1, according to ESPN, all 3 ESPN analysts, Kuiper, Reed, Miller, and Austin McNamara from Texas Tech, Kai Kroger from South Carolina. Those are the 3. I might be butchering Kroger's name, but it's Kroeger. So they have a lot of day 3 picks, Jake. It wouldn't shock me because of that, unless they hopefully they trade up, because I don't want to write about 10 draft picks either.
And I don't know what punter out there they would be interested in. The only one that was on a team in 2023 that is unsigned this year is Presley Harvin, and he was not good the Steelers. And the Steelers replaced him with Cameron Johnston. So I don't know. Well, is Tommy Townsend? No, Tommy Townsend signed with the Texans. Okay. So will it be an undrafted free agent? Will it be a draft pick? It'll be one of the 2. I am hoping that it is an undrafted free agent personally, or whatever they do, that they get it right, or that Brad Robbins just goes out there and starts banging 50-yarders every punt.
That's my hope. I hope Brad Robbins evolves and becomes the punter that the Bengals think he can become and takes a step forward. And what Darren Simmons said last month at the Combine was a mixture. They're certainly open to adding a punter, and I think they will, and he'll have competition, but they haven't slammed the door on Brad Robbins and the idea that he could be good. So hopefully that's what happens, because that's ideal, is signing an undrafted free agent. Brad Robbins comes in and kicks the mess out of the ball and kicks the tail of whatever free agent you sign and becomes your punter, and in a darn good one. So hopefully that's what happens. That's the best case scenario, I think, for the Bengals when it comes to punting.
It's the simplest way for things to work out, and we'll see what ends up happening there, but there will be competition. I think we can both agree that we're pretty confident about that. Appreciate all the questions for the mailbag this week, folks. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. That's going to do it, though, for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. We'll be back for the holiday weekend with a mock draft Monday. Then we'll get into some more draft content. It is officially draft season as the calendar turns to April here on Locked On Bengals. So again, Until next time, thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.